Before the horror began, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka were just ordinary individuals, shaped by their backgrounds and the circumstances that led them to meet each other. Yet, it is in the ordinary details of their lives that the seeds of their monstrous behavior were planted. Paul Bernardo's early life. Paul Bernardo was born on August 27, 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario, to a family that would play a significant role in shaping his future. His father, Kenneth Bernardo, was an abusive and tyrannical figure, often described as an angry and demanding man. Paul's mother, Marilyn, was meek and submissive, a woman who seemed perpetually caught in the grip of her husband's cruelty. The family dynamic was unhealthy from the start, with Paul's father controlling and belittling him, while his mother remained passive and distant. As a child, Paul exhibited troubling signs of emotional disturbance. He was frequently bullied at school due to his awkwardness and inability to fit in with the other children. These early years were marked by isolation, resentment, and a developing anger towards society. By the time he reached his teenage years, Paul was already showing early indications of violent tendencies. He had an obsession with pornography, particularly violent and degrading material, and began to fantasize about controlling and hurting women. This obsession would only grow stronger with time. Paul's frustrations were not confined to his home or school life. He began acting out, lashing out at those around him. His need for control, dominance, and submission was becoming apparent. Yet, for a time, he managed to maintain a facade of normalcy, blending in with the people around him. However, the darkness within was beginning to surface, and by his late teens, it was clear that Paul was struggling with deep psychological issues. At the age of 17, Paul graduated from high school and moved on to attend a local community college. Here, he began to refine his image, a smooth-talking, confident young man. He joined a fraternity and worked part-time jobs, which gave him the opportunity to interact with a range of people. Yet, beneath his social success, Paul's mind continued to wander into increasingly darker territory. His interests turned to control, manipulation, and power. He fantasized about humiliating women, degrading them, and forcing them into submission. His thoughts became his obsession, and they would define his future actions. At some point during these years, he began to develop a relationship with his first girlfriend, a woman he controlled and manipulated. It was in these early interactions that he honed his ability to emotionally and psychologically dominate others, a trait that would later become central to his relationship with Karla. But even as his life seemed to move forward, the violent thoughts inside Paul's head began to take form, and his fantasies were becoming far more violent and destructive than ever before. Karla Homolka's early life. Karla Homolka, born on May 4, 1970 in Port Credit, Ontario, had what seemed to be a typical childhood, at least on the surface. She was the eldest of 3 children in the Homolka family. Her parents, Dorothy and Karel, were both hardworking and caring, and to the outside world, they presented the image of a stable, loving family. However, beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy, Karla's life was marked by certain complexities that would later play a role in her involvement in horrific crimes. As a child, Karla was known for being sweet, charming, and obedient. She had a close relationship with her younger sister, Tammy, and her younger brother, and was often described as the good daughter in the family. Karla excelled in school, participating in various extracurricular activities, including cheerleading, and she had an interest in animals, which led her to eventually become a veterinary assistant. But despite her outwardly perfect life, Karla's upbringing was not without its issues. She had a difficult relationship with her parents, particularly with her father, who was strict and demanding. Karla's mother, Dorothy, was emotionally distant, often failing to provide Karla with the support she needed. In many ways, Karla seemed to crave validation and attention. As a teenager, she began to experiment with her appearance and sexuality, seeking affirmation from others. Karla's self-esteem issues were compounded by a growing desire for acceptance. She often felt overlooked or undervalued, especially in comparison to her peers. Her need for approval grew into an obsession, leading her to be more vulnerable to the advances of others. She became highly interested in relationships and quickly found herself infatuated with her first serious boyfriend, who at the time seemed to offer her the validation and attention she desperately wanted. But it was not until Karla met Paul Bernardo that her life would truly take a devastating turn. Their paths cross. In 1987, Karla was working at a pet store when she met Paul Bernardo. The two were introduced at a convention, and their chemistry was immediate. Paul was already known for his confident, charming demeanor, and Karla, eager for approval and validation, was drawn to him. He seemed like the perfect man, handsome, successful, and charismatic. Paul, for his part, was intrigued by Karla's beauty and innocence, and in her, he saw an opportunity for control. At first, their relationship was typical. They began dating, and Karla quickly became enamored with Paul. However, as their relationship deepened, Karla began to see a side of Paul that disturbed her. He was not just controlling, he was dangerous. Yet, instead of running from him, Karla found herself complicit in his actions. Paul began to confide in Karla about his violent fantasies, his obsession with domination, and his desire to harm women. But instead of being repulsed, Karla encouraged him. She wanted to please him, and in doing so, she was drawn deeper into his twisted world. As their relationship progressed, Paul began to push the boundaries of what Karla would tolerate. He took her to watch violent pornography, made her engage in degrading acts, and slowly introduced her to a world of control and manipulation that she would soon become fully immersed in. Karla, eager to maintain her bond with Paul and to prove her loyalty, allowed herself to be drawn further into his web. The idea of doing whatever it took to keep him happy and satisfied slowly overtook her ability to see right from wrong. She was no longer a passive participant in their relationship. She was an active participant in his fantasies, and in time, she would play an integral role in his crimes. From these seemingly innocuous beginnings, a deadly bond formed, one that would soon lead to unimaginable terror. By the late 1980s, a predator was stalking the streets of Scarborough, Ontario. He attacked swiftly, brutally, and without warning. Young women walking home alone were his preferred targets, and his method was always the same: an ambush from behind, a hand over the mouth, and an unrelenting act of sexual violence. This predator was careful. He struck in different locations, never lingering too long in one area. He varied the times of his attacks, avoiding patterns that would make it easy for police to catch him. He worked with chilling precision, ensuring that his victims were isolated and vulnerable before making his move. He enjoyed the hunt, the chase, and above all, the power. For years, authorities struggled to identify him. He became known as the Scarborough Rapist, a faceless terror responsible for a wave of violent sexual assaults. But while police worked tirelessly to track him down, Paul Bernardo walked freely among them, smiling, laughing, and pretending to be just another charming young man. But he was no ordinary man. He was a sadist, a monster hiding in plain sight. The first attacks, a pattern of violence. Paul's attacks began in 1987, though it is possible that he had engaged in criminal behavior before then. The first known victim was a 21-year-old woman walking home late at night. As she neared her house, Paul grabbed her from behind, dragged her to a secluded area, and violently raped her. When it was over, he fled, disappearing into the night like a ghost. The attack was brutal, but it would not be his last. Over the next several months, more victims came forward, each with eerily similar stories. A tall, blond man had ambushed them near bus stops or darkened alleyways, attacking them with terrifying force. He was cruel, he was methodical, and he seemed to enjoy their fear. Despite the growing number of reports, police struggled to find leads. Witness descriptions varied, and DNA technology was still in its infancy. Investigators knew they were dealing with a serial offender, but they did not yet know his name. Paul, meanwhile, continued to live his life as if nothing had changed. He maintained his job, spent time with friends, and even found time for romance. Then, in October 1987, Paul met Karla Homolka. The evolution of a killer, Paul and Karla's relationship. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable attraction between them. Paul was immediately drawn to Karla's beauty and obedience. She was young, impressionable, and eager to please him. For Paul, she was the perfect partner, someone who would not only accept his dark desires but indulge them. Their relationship moved quickly. Karla, only 17 years old, fell deeply in love with Paul. He was everything she had ever wanted: confident, handsome, and dominant. Paul, on the other hand, saw Karla as more than just a girlfriend. He saw her as a tool, someone who would not question his actions, someone who would help him get what he wanted. As they grew closer, Paul began to share his darkest fantasies with Karla. He told her about his past assaults. He spoke in detail about the fear and pain he had inflicted on his victims. Instead of recoiling in horror, Karla encouraged him. She laughed at his stories. She told him he was special. She told him she wanted to be his partner in everything, including his crimes. For Paul, this was the ultimate validation. He had found someone who did not just tolerate his cruelty, but embraced it. And with Karla by his side, he felt unstoppable. The Scarborough Rapist escalates. Between 1987 and 1990, Paul Bernardo continued his reign of terror. His attacks grew bolder, more violent. He refined his methods, learning how to avoid capture while inflicting maximum suffering. He would stalk his victims for days, watching them, memorizing their routines. He knew exactly when they would be alone. He knew when to strike. Victims described their attacker as charming yet terrifying. He often spoke to them during the assaults, taunting them, telling them how much he enjoyed their pain. He treated each attack as a game, taking pleasure in the knowledge that no one could stop him. Meanwhile, the police were growing desperate. They had linked at least 19 assaults to the Scarborough Rapist, but they had no suspects. Investigators launched a massive manhunt, interviewing hundreds of people, collecting DNA samples, and issuing warnings to women across the region. In 1990, they finally got a break. A composite sketch of the suspect was released to the public, based on witness descriptions. The image was striking, a young blonde man with a strong jawline and piercing eyes. The resemblance to Paul Bernardo was undeniable. But Paul was arrogant. When friends and co-workers joked about how much he looked like the sketch, he laughed along with them. He knew he had left no evidence behind. He believed he was untouchable. And for a time he was. The DNA mistake, a missed opportunity. In 1990, Paul Bernardo was finally brought in for questioning. Investigators had received an anonymous tip naming him as a possible suspect. He fit the profile, and more importantly, he looked exactly like the composite sketch. But Paul was a master manipulator. He smiled. He charmed the detectives. He answered their questions with ease, never once appearing nervous. When they asked for a DNA sample, he agreed without hesitation. Then he walked out of the police station, confident that he had fooled them once again. What Paul did not realize was that his luck was running out. The DNA sample he had provided was sent for testing. If processed immediately, it would have revealed his identity as the Scarborough Rapist. But bureaucracy and backlog delayed the results. Months passed, then a year. Paul remained a free man. And in the meantime, he was about to commit his first murder. Paul's growing violence towards Karla. By late 1990, Paul's relationship with Karla had taken a dark turn. The man she had once adored was becoming increasingly violent and erratic. He began hitting her regularly, berating her, pushing her further into submission. But Karla did not leave. She did not fight back. Instead, she gave Paul the ultimate gift, her own little sister, Tammy Homolka. Paul had grown obsessed with Tammy. He wanted her, and he made no effort to hide it. Karla, desperate to keep Paul happy, agreed to help him. On Christmas Eve, 1990, Karla drugged her 15-year-old sister, allowing Paul to rape her while she lay unconscious. The entire attack was recorded on video. But something went wrong. Tammy began to choke on her own vomit. She convulsed. She stopped breathing. Paul and Karla panicked. They cleaned her body, dressed her, and called 911, claiming Tammy had suffered an accident. By the time paramedics arrived, Tammy was dead. No one suspected a thing. Her death was ruled an accident, a tragic case of alcohol and drug poisoning. Paul and Karla got away with murder. And with Tammy gone, Paul's thirst for violence only grew stronger. The final transformation. Paul was no longer satisfied with random assaults. He wanted total control. He wanted permanent victims. And with Karla by his side, he knew exactly how to get them. The Scarborough Rapist had evolved. Now he was a killer. And soon, 2 more young women would die at his hands. By the early months of 1991, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka had crossed the final threshold into unthinkable brutality. The assault and murder of Tammy Homolka had not been an accident in their eyes. It had been an initiation. Now they had developed a taste for something far worse than rape alone. Paul no longer wanted fleeting control over his victims. He wanted permanent ownership. He wanted to kill. Karla had proven her loyalty. She had not only stood by him after Tammy's death, but had actively helped him commit the crime. Paul had escalated, and Karla had followed without question. There was no going back now. And so, in the summer of 1991, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka would claim their next victim. The abduction and murder of Leslie Mahaffy. On the night of June 14, 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffy was locked out of her house after missing curfew. She had spent the evening with friends and arrived home late, only to find the doors locked and her family asleep. Frustrated, she wandered through her quiet Burlington neighborhood, unaware that a predator was watching. Paul Bernardo had been prowling the streets that night, looking for his next victim. When he saw Leslie alone, he seized the opportunity. He approached her, striking up a conversation with his usual charm. Leslie, young and unaware of the danger, let her guard down just long enough. In an instant, Paul overpowered her. He forced her into his car, blindfolded her, and drove back to the home he shared with Karla. For the next 24 hours, Leslie Mahaffy endured unimaginable torment. Paul and Karla videotaped everything, capturing the full extent of their cruelty. They took turns assaulting her, treating her as nothing more than a disposable plaything. Karla, ever the devoted accomplice, was not just a passive bystander. She participated. She laughed. She obeyed. She helped. At some point, it became clear to Paul that they could not let Leslie go. She had seen too much. She could identify them. She had to die. The exact details of how Leslie was murdered remain unclear. Some reports suggest she was strangled, while others claim Paul and Karla administered a fatal overdose. What is certain is that by the morning of June 15, 1991, Leslie Mahaffy was dead. Now they had a problem: what to do with the body. Paul, ever methodical, had a plan. He and Karla dismembered Leslie's corpse, cutting her body into small pieces and encasing them in cement blocks. Once the task was complete, they drove to Lake Gibson, where they dumped the concrete blocks into the water. And then, as if nothing had happened, Paul and Karla went to Karla's parents' house for Father's Day dinner. The murder of Kristen French. If killing Leslie Mahaffy had troubled Karla in any way, she did not show it. If she had any regrets, they did not stop her from doing it again. On April 16, 1992, 15-year-old Kristen French was walking home from school in St. Catharines, Ontario. As she approached a church parking lot, she noticed a couple in a car, seemingly lost. The woman, Karla Homolka, was holding a map and calling for help. Kristen, kind-hearted and trusting, approached to give directions. That was all the opportunity Paul and Karla needed. In a choreographed abduction, Paul jumped out of the car, forced Kristen inside, and drove off while Karla held her down. The entire kidnapping took less than a minute. In broad daylight, just meters away from a busy road, Kristen French vanished. For the next 3 days, she was held captive in Paul and Karla's home. The videos from those days would later reveal the true horror of what Kristen endured. She was tortured. She was raped repeatedly. Paul and Karla took turns degrading her, forcing her to perform dehumanizing acts while the camera recorded. Paul treated Kristen as his personal slave, making her obey his every command, punishing her when she resisted. Throughout it all, Kristen fought back. She refused to comply easily. She did not break. Even in her final moments, she tried to retain her dignity. But Paul did not care. By the end of April 19, 1992, Kristen French was dead. Paul strangled her to death with an electrical cord. Just as they had with Leslie, Paul and Karla disposed of Kristen's body. This time, they simply dumped her in a ditch near a rural road. A community in fear, the investigation grows. Kristen French's abduction was different from Paul's previous attacks. Unlike his usual method of striking at night and disappearing without a trace, Kristen had been kidnapped in daylight, in a public area. Witnesses had seen her talking to a couple in a beige car. Her disappearance was immediately treated as a high-profile case. The police launched one of the largest manhunts in Ontario's history, distributing flyers, organizing search parties, and questioning hundreds of people. For 3 days, the town of St. Catharines held its breath, hoping Kristen would return alive. But when her bruised and battered body was discovered, hope turned to rage. The town was in shock. 2 young girls, Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French, had been brutally murdered in less than a year. The media exploded with coverage, warning women to stay vigilant. But despite the growing pressure, Paul and Karla still felt untouchable. Paul continued his abusive grip on Karla, regularly beating her and asserting his control. Karla, still devoted, continued to assist in his sick fantasies. But cracks were beginning to show. And soon, the world would find out the truth about Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. The beginning of the end. By late 1992, Paul's violent behavior had escalated beyond Karla's control. The once devoted partner was now a victim herself, beaten and bruised, living in fear of the same man she had once worshipped. Paul's paranoia was growing. He suspected the police were closing in. He became reckless, violent, careless. Then, in January 1993, Karla finally snapped. After a particularly brutal beating, Karla left Paul and moved back in with her family. She arrived with 2 black eyes and a swollen face, telling relatives that Paul had been abusing her for years. That was the moment everything changed. The police had already been investigating Paul in connection to the Scarborough Rapist attacks. DNA results had finally come back, and they were a match. Paul Bernardo's luck had run out. The arrest of Paul Bernardo. On February 17, 1993, police raided Paul and Karla's home. Inside, they found a disturbing collection of videotapes, evidence that documented the full extent of their crimes. Paul Bernardo was arrested and charged with multiple counts of rape and murder. Karla Homolka, realizing she faced a life sentence, made a chilling decision. She turned on Paul. She betrayed the man she had once called her soulmate. And in exchange for a reduced sentence, she confessed everything. By February 1993, Paul Bernardo was finally behind bars. After years of brutal assaults, multiple rapes, and the murders of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen, the authorities had him. But the full extent of his crimes was still unknown. And Karla Homolka, his willing accomplice, the woman who had laughed while helping him torture his victims, was about to make a shocking deal that would allow her to walk free in just 12 years. Karla's betrayal, the deal with the devil. The moment Paul was arrested, Karla knew she was in trouble. For years, she had been a participant in his crimes, not just as a passive witness, but as an active predator. She had drugged her own sister so Paul could rape her. She had lured Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen to their deaths. She had even assaulted victims herself. If the prosecution treated her as an equal accomplice, she would face life in prison with no chance of parole. But Karla was manipulative, just as dangerous as Paul but far more cunning. She reinvented herself as a victim. She claimed that Paul had forced her to participate, that she had been abused and brainwashed, too afraid to disobey him. She painted herself as a battered woman, not a sadistic murderer. And in the end, it worked. The prosecution, desperate to convict Paul, offered Karla a plea bargain in exchange for her full cooperation. In July 1993, Karla pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter for her role in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen. In return, she received a 12-year prison sentence. The media erupted in outrage. Journalists, legal experts, and the public called it the deal with the devil. People were horrified. How could Karla, a woman who had played an equal role in these horrific crimes, receive such a light sentence? How could a killer walk free in just a decade, while the families of Leslie and Kristen would grieve for a lifetime? But at the time, the prosecution believed they had made the best decision. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that there were videotapes. Tapes that would later reveal the truth about Karla Homolka. The hidden tapes, evidence of Karla's true nature. While Paul was awaiting trial, his defense team discovered something shocking. A collection of videotapes hidden inside the couple's house. These tapes were not just evidence. They were recordings of the rapes and murders themselves. They showed everything. And most damning of all, they proved that Karla had lied. Far from being a coerced victim, Karla was seen in the tapes fully participating in the assaults. She laughed. She taunted. She helped Paul restrain the victims. On camera, she was just as sadistic as he was. The tapes were smoking gun evidence, proof that Karla deserved a life sentence. But it was too late. Because of the plea bargain, the prosecution couldn't revoke her deal. She had secured her freedom before the world knew the full truth. The trial of Paul Bernardo. With Karla's testimony locked in, the prosecution moved forward with Paul's trial in 1995. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen, 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault, numerous counts of rape related to the Scarborough attacks. The trial lasted for 4 months. During that time, the jury was forced to watch the videotapes, graphic, sickening footage of Paul and Karla's crimes. Several jurors had to leave the courtroom in tears. Some had nightmares for weeks. Even hardened detectives who had seen countless murder cases said the tapes were some of the most disturbing evidence they had ever witnessed. The most damning testimony came from Karla herself. Though the public hated her, she was still the prosecution's key witness. She described in detail how Paul had kidnapped, raped, and murdered their victims. She claimed she had been forced to participate. Paul, for his part, denied everything. He insisted that Leslie and Kristen's deaths were accidents. He claimed that their sex acts were consensual. But the tapes didn't lie. On September 1, 1995, Paul Bernardo was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison with the designation of a dangerous offender, meaning he would never be eligible for parole. Justice had finally been served, at least for Paul. But for Karla, justice never came. Karla Homolka's release, a murderer walks free. Despite the videotapes proving her guilt, Karla Homolka could not be retried due to double jeopardy laws. So, on July 4, 2005, Karla Homolka walked free after serving just 12 years in prison. The public erupted in anger. Protests were held. Editorials condemned the justice system. People demanded that Karla be monitored for life. But the law could do nothing. Karla changed her name. She moved away. She started a new life. She got married again. She had children. She blended into society, as if she had never helped murder two young girls. Meanwhile, the families of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen were left with nothing but grief. Paul Bernardo's fate, a monster behind bars. Paul Bernardo remains in prison to this day. He is housed in Millhaven Institution, a maximum security prison in Ontario. Over the years, he has been denied parole multiple times, as he is still considered one of Canada's most dangerous criminals. In 2023, Bernardo was controversially transferred to a medium security prison, sparking public outrage. The victims' families called it a betrayal of justice. But even with this transfer, Bernardo remains locked away. He will never walk free. The legacy of the Ken and Barbie Killers. The case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka remains one of the most infamous crimes in Canadian history. It changed the way law enforcement handled serial offenders, led to advancements in DNA testing, and raised critical questions about plea bargains for violent criminals. But most of all, it left behind a wound that can never heal. Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen were bright, innocent young women, stolen from their families in the most brutal way possible. And while Paul Bernardo rots in prison, Karla Homolka walks free, a chilling reminder that justice is not always served. Even after the convictions, the case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka refused to fade into history. Their crimes were too monstrous, their betrayals too great, and their sentences too controversial. The people of Canada, and the world, were left with lingering questions, unresolved anger, and a justice system that had allowed one of its worst criminals to walk free. Paul Bernardo's life in prison, a monster behind bars. Paul Bernardo, once the arrogant, sadistic predator who terrorized Ontario, had been reduced to a despised inmate, locked away in maximum security. After his conviction in 1995, he was sent to Kingston Penitentiary, one of Canada's toughest prisons. There, he quickly discovered that even among hardened criminals there was a code, and rapists and child killers were considered the lowest of the low. For the first several years of his sentence, Bernardo was kept in isolation. Not for his own safety, though he would have been a prime target for prison violence, but because no other prisoners wanted anything to do with him. He spent 23 hours a day in his cell, with only brief moments outside for showers and exercise. He had no access to television, no internet, no human connection beyond his guards. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost in a cage. Bernardo's failed appeals and public fury. In the years that followed, Paul Bernardo attempted multiple appeals, each one more desperate than the last. In 2000, he applied for a new trial, claiming that his conviction was unfair. His legal team argued that the videotapes of the rapes and murders had been too prejudicial, that the jury had been emotionally swayed by their content. The judge dismissed his request immediately. In 2006, Bernardo attempted to claim that his designation as a dangerous offender was unjust, hoping for a chance at parole. His petition was met with universal outrage. The families of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen spoke out, vowing to fight any possibility of his release. Public protests erupted. Even politicians, who usually avoided commenting on criminal cases, condemned his actions. His appeal was denied again. By 2018, Bernardo had served over 25 years in prison and was technically eligible to apply for parole. But when he did, it was clear he had no chance. When he faced the parole board, he showed no remorse. No guilt. No sorrow. He was the same monster he had always been. The board immediately rejected his request, calling him an ongoing danger to society. By 2023, he had spent 30 years behind bars when the Canadian government made a controversial decision. They transferred him from maximum security to medium security. The public was outraged. Victims' families, journalists, and legal experts demanded to know why a dangerous serial killer was being moved to a less restrictive facility. Paul Bernardo, now in his late 50s, remains incarcerated, but the debate over his prison conditions continues. He will never be released, but the fight to ensure he remains in the harshest possible conditions is ongoing. Karla Homolka, a killer, walks free. While Paul rotted in prison, Karla Homolka was living a new life. On July 4, 2005, she walked out of prison a free woman, having served just 12 years for her role in the rapes and murders. The backlash was immediate and fierce. The public viewed her as a manipulative liar who had escaped justice. The families of the victims were devastated, knowing the woman who had helped murder their daughters was now free to start over. And that's exactly what she did. A new identity, a new family. Upon her release, Karla knew she could never return to Ontario. There was too much hatred waiting for her. So, she changed her name. She moved to Quebec, where she kept a low profile. Then, in a move that stunned the public, Karla got married to the brother of her own lawyer, Thierry Bordelais. Even more shocking, she had children. The idea that a convicted child murderer was now a mother sickened many. How could a woman who had drugged, raped, and murdered her own 15-year-old sister now be trusted to raise children? But legally, there was nothing anyone could do. Public sightings and confrontations. Despite trying to keep a low profile, Karla couldn't escape the public eye. In 2007, journalists tracked her down in Guadeloupe, a French overseas territory in the Caribbean. She had moved there with her husband and children, hoping to escape Canadian media attention. For a while it worked. She lived in anonymity, blending in with the local population. But in 2012, she quietly returned to Canada. Then in 2016, the unthinkable happened. Karla Homolka was discovered working at an elementary school in Montreal. Parents were horrified to learn that a notorious sex offender and murderer had been volunteering at their children's school. They demanded her removal, but legally, there were no restrictions on her working with children. The school faced immense backlash, and Karla eventually withdrew from public life once again. Even now, she remains a ghost, surfacing only when journalists or concerned citizens track her down. The families of the victims, a lifetime of pain. For the Mahaffy and French families, the pain never faded. They have spent decades mourning their daughters, knowing that one of their killers is free. Every time Karla reappears in the news, they are forced to relive their worst nightmares. Every time Paul applies for parole, they must fight to ensure he stays behind bars. They have attended every hearing, spoken at every opportunity, and vowed that neither Paul nor Karla will ever be forgotten. The case that changed Canada forever. The crimes of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka had lasting effects on Canadian law. DNA technology. The case proved the importance of DNA evidence, leading to faster testing methods that could identify violent offenders before they escalated. Plea bargains reform. After the deal with the Devil scandal, prosecutors became more cautious about offering plea deals in major crimes. Victims' rights. The family's public fight for justice led to greater protections and rights for victims' families in the criminal justice system. But despite these changes, one thing remains true. Justice was never fully served. Paul Bernardo may be in prison for life, but Karla Homolka is free, living as if her past never happened. She will never serve another day in prison. She will never answer for what she did on those tapes. And for the families of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French, that is the greatest injustice of all. Final words. The story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka is one of the darkest in Canadian history. It is a story of pure evil, manipulation, and betrayal. But more than that, it is a story of innocent lives stolen, families shattered, and a justice system that failed when it mattered most. Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French should still be here. They should have grown up, followed their dreams, started families of their own. But instead, they became victims of monsters. And the world will never forget them. The crimes of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka did not just destroy the lives of their victims and their families. They left a permanent scar on Canadian society. Even decades later, the shock, horror, and outrage of their crimes continue to haunt the public, shaping legal policies, inspiring new laws, and igniting debates about justice, rehabilitation, and the true nature of evil. This was not just another criminal case. It was a catastrophic failure of law enforcement, a shocking betrayal of justice, and a terrifying glimpse into the mind of two of the most sadistic killers Canada has ever seen. And even today, the story is far from over. There are thousands of violent crimes in history. Many are just as horrifying, just as tragic. But few have captured the public's obsession like the case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. Why? Because this case defied expectations. Paul and Karla did not fit the typical mold of serial killers. They were not the lone, shadowy figures stalking victims in the night. They were not the social outcasts living on the fringes of society. They were a handsome, young, well-dressed couple, a golden pair who looked, on the outside, like the perfect image of success. They were the Ken and Barbie Killers, a phrase that still sends chills down the spine. The idea that evil could look so normal, so attractive, so charming, was what terrified the public the most. It shattered the illusion that monsters are easy to spot, that they look different from us. Because Paul and Karla looked like people you might know. Your next-door neighbors. Your colleagues. Your friends. And yet, behind closed doors, they were sadistic predators, torturing and killing innocent young girls for their own twisted pleasure. That contrast, the mask of normalcy hiding pure evil, is what keeps this case alive in the public consciousness, decades after the crimes were committed. And for the families of the victims, the pain never fades. The unanswered questions: what did Karla know, and what else did they do? Despite the overwhelming evidence of their crimes, some questions remain unanswered. To this day, many believe that Karla Homolka was more involved than she ever admitted. Did she commit more crimes? Did she help Bernardo rape other women before Leslie and Kristen? And most chilling of all, were there more victims? The suspicion of more murders. Paul Bernardo was a known serial rapist long before he escalated to murder. Between 1987 and 1990, he committed dozens of violent sexual assaults in Scarborough. But police failed to catch him, even when they had a DNA sample in their hands. And here's where things get terrifying. Paul and Karla did not just start killing out of nowhere in 1990. Serial killers often escalate gradually. There are unsolved murders in Ontario from that time period that match Bernardo's MO. Karla herself hinted in police interviews that she knew of other victims, but never gave details. Some detectives believe that Bernardo may have killed before Leslie Mahaffy. If true, that means there could be more victims, young women who disappeared, their fates never known. And because Karla took her plea bargain, she never had to answer for any other crimes she may have committed. She got away with murder, literally. And the full truth may never be known. Karla Homolka, how did she escape true justice? To this day, the biggest question that haunts the public is simple. How did Karla Homolka get away with it? The answer lies in timing, deception, and a colossal failure by the prosecution. The lie that saved her. When Paul was arrested in 1993, Karla immediately turned on him. She played the role of the battered wife, claiming she had been forced into the crimes, that she was a victim herself. At the time, the prosecution believed her, because they didn't have the videotapes yet. Desperate to secure a conviction against Bernardo, they offered Karla a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation. But just weeks after her deal was finalized, police discovered the videotapes, which proved Karla was just as guilty as Paul. She had lied. She had not been a victim, she had been a willing, active participant. But by then it was too late. She had already signed the deal. And thanks to double jeopardy laws, she could never be retried. She escaped true justice, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The public's endless anger, Karla's life as a free woman. Even after her early release in 2005, Karla Homolka never truly escaped the public's wrath. People saw her as a murderer who got away with it, and they made sure she knew it. In 2007, reporters tracked her down in Guadeloupe, forcing her into hiding. In 2012, she quietly returned to Canada, trying to disappear into normal life. In 2016, she was discovered volunteering at a school, causing outrage across the country. To this day, anytime she is found, people demand that she be exposed for what she is. She may be free, but she will never be truly accepted. And for the families of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French, that is the only small victory they have left. A case that changed Canada forever. The impact of the Ken and Barbie Killers case can still be felt today. Stronger DNA testing. If police had tested Bernardo's DNA in 1988, he could have been caught years earlier, preventing the murders of Leslie and Kristen. Tighter restrictions on plea deals. The deal with the devil scandal changed how prosecutors handle cases involving violent criminals. Better tracking of serial offenders. After Bernardo's crimes, Canada expanded its violent offender database, making it harder for criminals to escape detection. But for all these changes, one tragic truth remains. Justice was never fully served. Paul Bernardo will die in prison, but his victims never got to live. Karla Homolka is free, but the families of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French are trapped in their grief forever. And no matter how many years pass, the horror of this case will never truly fade. Final words. a warning for the future. The case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka is not just a horrifying chapter in history. It is a warning that evil does not always look like a monster, a warning that justice is not always guaranteed, a warning that there are people in this world, charming, beautiful, and seemingly normal, who are capable of unthinkable cruelty. And most of all, it is a reminder. We must never forget the victims. Never forget Leslie Mahaffy. Never forget Kristen French. And never forget that justice failed them. Because if we do, then the next Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka might already be out there, waiting. The story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka is more than just a horrific crime saga. It is a dark stain on history, a tale of unimaginable evil, justice denied, and lessons that should never be ignored. From the moment Paul began his reign of terror as the Scarborough Rapist, to the chilling, premeditated murders of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French, to the shocking betrayal of Karla Homolka, who was just as guilty yet walked free, this case remains one of the most infamous examples of the justice system's failures. Even decades later, this case continues to haunt law enforcement, legal scholars, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike. Why? Because it represents everything we fear the most. That monsters can look like us. That justice is not always served. That some people, no matter how much we try to understand them, are simply evil. And perhaps worst of all, that it could happen again. Why this case still matters today. We often think of history as something that lives in the past, something we can learn from and move forward. But cases like this are not just distant memories. They serve as constant warnings. Even today, serial offenders continue to slip through the cracks. Violent predators manipulate the system. And innocent people, just like Leslie and Kristen, still fall victim to evil. This case exposed critical failures in Canada's justice system. Police incompetence and delays in DNA testing allowed Paul Bernardo to rape and terrorize dozens of women for years before he was caught. The rushed plea bargain allowed Karla Homolka, a willing and enthusiastic participant in these horrific crimes, to walk free after just 12 years. The inability to prevent her from rejoining society meant that she was later found working at a school, around children, despite her role in the sexual abuse and murder of minors. The question we must ask ourselves is this: has the system really changed? Or could another Paul and Karla be lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike? The truth is chilling. As long as justice can be bought, manipulated, or ignored, history can repeat itself. Remembering the victims, never let their names be forgotten. More than anything, this case is about the innocent young girls who never had a chance to live their full lives. Leslie Mahaffy, only 14 years old, abducted from her own home, tortured, raped, and murdered, her body sawed into pieces and encased in concrete. Kristen French, only 15 years old, taken in broad daylight, imprisoned, violated, and murdered, her body discarded like garbage. Their names must never be forgotten. Their suffering must never be reduced to a mere footnote in history. Because Leslie and Kristen were more than just victims. They were daughters, friends, young women with dreams and futures, stolen away by two monsters who cared for nothing but their own sick desires. We must say their names, remember their stories, honor their memory, and most of all, never let what happened to them happen again. If there's one thing this case has taught us, it's that awareness is powerful. We cannot change the past. We cannot bring Leslie and Kristen back. But what we can do is learn from history, expose failures, and demand better from our justice system. That is why it's important to keep these stories alive, so that the next time a predator like Paul Bernardo tries to hide behind a mask of normalcy, we see the signs before it's too late. And that's why we need your help. If you found this documentary informative, if you believe these stories need to be told, and if you want to help expose true crime cases that demand justice, then Backhand Index Pointing Right, subscribe to our channel, so you never miss an in-depth, fact-based true crime story. Thumbs up like this video, because every interaction helps spread awareness. Bell turn on notifications, so you're the first to know when we release another deep dive into true crime's most chilling cases. Memo comment below. Share your thoughts on this case, your opinions on Karla Homolka's release, and whether you believe justice was truly served. Your voice matters. Your awareness matters. Because if we forget these crimes, if we let these stories fade, then we are doomed to let history repeat itself. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never stop seeking justice.